So it's been a few weeks since I did a video on the Sue Neill Fraser case. So I apologise for those people who are following this case, and I apologise to Sue's supporters and everyone who follows this series. To be honest, while I could have skipped on and done a different video in the series, part of the reason for the delay is that I just found it hard to get to this video because of the detective that it discusses. To me, every time I look at him, I just get this reaction to this guy. He comes across to me as a complete pompous ass, and he actually makes my blood boil. So on one hand, I would be quite happy to ignore him and not do any videos on him. But at the same time, I'm not doing any favours for Sue and her supporters if I ignore this guy, because he is largely responsible for Sue being stuck in prison for all those years. And personally, from the interview that I'm about to play for you, I don't know how this guy got given the position that he got into as a detective. He seems either incompetent or lazy, I don't know. And I certainly have questions over him being given an award for excellence for his role in the Sue Neill Fraser case. To me, it just seems like a ploy by people who are higher up on the food chain, who want to save their own asses because they know that this guy did the wrong thing, and also to try and make him look impressive as a countermeasure for the fight that's still going on to clear Sue's name by giving him this award. It's like they're trying to say, hey, look, this guy can do no wrong because he got given an award for this case. So those people who are fighting and saying that Sue was unjustly treated must be wrong. It's basically how the boys' club in Hobart works. If someone does something that is not quite legally correct, they are rewarded with a promotion, retirement, or an award. Because that way, it's like saying, hey, look, this is a hero. Don't question him. My observation as an outsider looking in is that this guy was really good at manipulating the media. Although that said, I've also noticed that when it comes to Tasmanian media, there are two particular outlets which seem to employ journalists who are not independent thinkers. And it seems to be quite easy for individuals such as this Detective Powell to go to these two particular media outlets and tell them what they should be publishing. So for this video, I've used an excerpt from the 7+ series Undercurrent, in which retired detective Colin McLaren, who was investigating on Sue's behalf, organised to have a meeting with this Detective Powell in order to discuss Sue's case. I found his reactions fascinating and very telling, and I have to say I completely agree with Colin McLaren's assessment of this detective, which I include at the end of the video.
I'm not aware of a previous case in Tasmania where a body hasn't been recovered, where charges of murder have been preferred. However long it takes, we'll certainly still be looking for an answer. We're happy that a lot of hard work ended up with the right result.
Peter Powell was the inspector in charge, now retired, and I thought it was very important to talk to him because there was a few things that really worried me. I had questions I wanted to put to him about why there was only one suspect in this case, Sue Neill Fraser, when by this stage I thought there was quite a lot of different suspects, and certainly the landscape that I'd seen, that I'd come to uncover, was showing all sorts of other potential suspects.
So, at this point in his own investigation, Colin McLaren had access to all the detective files in relation to Sue's case. He had spoken to multiple witnesses, which detectives hadn't even identified. So a number of yacht owners from the area, which for some reason detectives, when investigating the case, didn't bother speaking to. Otherwise they would have found out that there were continuous break-ins on yachts and that people had reached a point where they weren't bothering to report them anymore because the police weren't doing anything about it. There, of course, was also Megan Vass, whose DNA was identified while Sue's case was in court, and yet that avenue was never pursued, and the fact that her associates, as they called them, were known criminals and known for break-ins and stuff like that, and yet they were not investigated or questioned, was another thing that at that point in time Colin McLaren was well aware of. He'd also spoken to witnesses who mentioned a man on a yacht extremely close to the Four Winds. And I will do a separate episode on the other yacht. And of course there was the man sleeping rough in his car who actually went into Tas Police a short time after Bob went missing, tried to give a statement regarding Ms. Vass and her colleagues and regarding the guy on the yacht, and was never taken seriously, which is something we will discover shortly during this interview.
They've asserted several times they've got new evidence. Well, I'd like to see what new solid evidence they've got, because certainly the coroner doesn't think they've got any.
Is it just me, or is that the weirdest, dumbest statement that a detective has ever made? He's not saying, well, I don't think they have any. He's saying, well, certainly the coroner doesn't think they have any. Okay, so let's explain. Well, I'll explain how the coroner system in Tasmania works. Basically, the coroner is one individual who is given police reports and medical reports from a case, goes through them, and then comes to a decision based on the police reports and the medical reports. The coroner in Tasmania doesn't go out and do their own personal investigating. So, for starters, there's no medical reports from this case because Bob was never found. So all the coroner has to go on in this particular case is police reports. So him going, well, certainly the coroner doesn't think so. Like, duh. I will also point out here that you have that whole boys' club thing going on in Tassie. So really, if you look into it, you'll see that the coroner isn't really independent of Tasmania Police. I don't think that you'd be likely to find any cases in which the coroner has ruled against whatever Tas Police have come up with as an outcome.
With Peter Powell, he just bounced into the room and shook my hand, and it was all jovial, but I was there for a reason, to understand why he only ever had one suspect. Alrighty, Peter. Obviously, it's about Sue Neill Fraser's case. Probably the most sensational murder case in recent history in Australia, I think it's fair to say.
I think that's quite right, yes.
Why do you think this case is so fascinating to Australia, not just Tasmania?
It is one of those really unusual cases where there's no eyewitness to the murder, there's no identifiable cause of death, no confession, and the whole case really does revolve around circumstantial evidence. It's all about the lead up to when Bob Chappell went missing, and then of course her various different stories after Bob went missing, from the very first morning when she lied about her movements, that, you know, she seemed to be changing her version of events every time she gleaned some information about how the investigation was developing.
I do want to point out a few things about the body language that you can see in this interview. You have Colin McLaren here in a very relaxed pose and showing signs of the active listener. He is looking at Detective Powell. He has his hands rested on his chin, which show to me that he is relaxed. He is pointing his focus directly at Detective Powell, and he is listening openly. I don't see anything hostile in his body language at all. Detective Powell, you probably noticed, looks like a John Cleese parody. That probably sounds a little bit mean, but I can just picture John Cleese doing a parody of a detective with his head stuck up in the air and his nose stuck up in the air, like he is trying to look down on the other detective who is interviewing him. He doesn't have, to me, he doesn't appear to have a very relaxed or open position in the way he's sitting. Note too that at the start of this interview, there are 2 full jugs of water in front of him. This guy is gripping onto his glass of water so fiercely, and he seems to be constantly guzzling at this water.
Do you think there was any tunnel vision during the investigation?
No, I don't think so, because we did come back to, in the finish it was, you know, when we looked at all the scenarios, suicide, fake disappearance or whatever, murder by someone else, we always came back to Sue, and we came back to Sue because of the overwhelming, in my view, circumstantial evidence.
Firstly, let's remember that there was no circumstantial evidence. There was a lot of made-up evidence, there was ignored evidence, but overwhelming circumstantial evidence? Yeah, nah, I don't think so. But essentially his response here when asked, do you think there was a bit of a case of tunnel vision here? His response was, no, I don't think there was tunnel vision because we considered this, this and this, But at the end of the day, we came back to Sue Neill Fraser. He's not given anything solid, for starters, to say why that isn't tunnel vision. Saying, we looked at a few things, but we came back to Sue Neill Fraser. He's not given any justification whatsoever. Nothing to convince me that it wasn't tunnel vision. Quite the opposite, really, because having looked at the case, I know that there wasn't a bunch of circumstantial evidence. So to cite that as being the reason for them definitely not having tunnel vision in the case doesn't make sense to me whatsoever.
If you look at the 27th of January 2009 as the day Bob disappeared, or the night before, when did Sue become suspect? How many days after?
Late February, early March, but I'd be the first to say that we had this witness, Philip Triffett, come forward and speak to the police on the 29th of January.
But you first had contact with him at 4 o'clock on the 28th. That's the day after.
Yeah, and I thought it was 2 days after.
So I will come back to this at a later date, and I have touched on it briefly before. But Philip Triffett, who they're referring to, is a well-known criminal to Tasmanian police who came forward because he had charges against him, and he basically approached New Norfolk Police and said, I can give you some information about Sue Neill Fraser if you can make my charges go away or be diminished. Had Tasmania Police not been wanting to just finish this case or make the case go their own way, they would have never, ever looked at this guy as a serious witness, particularly given the close associations between the Triffett family from the area where this guy is from and the family of the associate of Megan Vass, who it appears almost certainly that he was in fact the person responsible for the death of Bob Chappell. I continuously go back to the question, was Philip Triffett encouraged to go forward by family members of the young man who killed Bob Triffett in order to cover up for the crime? Either way, the guy is not a credible witness, should never have been considered, ever. And of course, the point that Colin has proven here, which Detective Powell basically admitted to himself, is that while on one hand this detective is going, well, we didn't really start looking closely at Sue until late February, but at the same time, Colin McLaren has pointed out, you spoke to this Triffett guy the day after Bob went missing. I think Colin McLaren makes a really good point there, and I think that they decided that Triffett made a very convenient witness for them, and that this would be an easy way to sew up the case. Of course, I believe also that it has been said that Sue did put this little man in his place quite early on in the piece. So I wonder if his ego got a little bit bruised, and that's why he went so hard after Sue.
My reading of the log suggests from that point forward Sue's the suspect.
No, I don't agree. There were no other obvious suspects.
There was a fellow living in his yellow Ford sedan, a guy by the name of Stephen Gleeson.
Yep.
Could he be considered a suspect? He's so close to the vicinity of the Four Winds.
Well, he was certainly spoken to on that morning, the 27th.
Was a statement taken, or was a record of interview conducted?
Not that day, no. He was spoken to by police that first went to the scene.
So, there was a homeless man living out of his car at the marina the night that Bob went missing. Police spoke to him at his vehicle on the day that they discovered Bob was missing, but there wasn't a record of interview. And in actual fact, Gleeson went into the police station a few weeks later and tried to get them to listen to him about the teenage girl that he said was on board Bob's yacht that night. But they never recorded it. And the first actual solid legal statement from this man didn't occur till much later, when Colin McLaren organised a statement from him with lawyer Jeff Thompson, and these were acting on behalf of Sue Neill Fraser. Because, of course, if you're investigating a disappearance of someone, which you later presumed to be a murder, why would you look at the homeless man who was sleeping in his car so close to the yacht on the night that the man went missing? The homeless man with a violent past and a criminal past. Why would you want to look at him over a middle-class woman with no history of violence, no criminal history, not even a traffic ticket?
But there was nothing that we felt that, made him a suspect.
There's a fellow in the yacht moored next to Four Winds. There was a fellow in a yacht called Paul Rowe. He is a man of violence. Might you not consider pulling him in for an interview for reasons of completeness?
Because, of course, it doesn't look suspicious at all that this guy with a violent history, who, according to some, has been known as a hitman, whose yacht was moored within spitting distance of the Four Winds, and who pulled up anchor on the morning when police were all buzzing around Four Winds, and moved his yacht or boat to Constitution Wharf away from the area completely. Why would you consider him to be suspect in any way? Certainly you wouldn't consider him over this middle-class woman with no criminal history.
Okay, so Paul Rowe, I think we didn't know about Paul Rowe at all until after Sue was convicted. Gleeson told us
But
about
he was the closest yacht to Four Winds.
Not at the time, I don't
Yes, he was.
Well, he certainly wasn't known to us. Let me
I
say
walked
that.
into here 5 months ago and asked to see the manager of the Royal Yacht Club, and the first thing he said to me, why don't you chase up Paul Rowe? And everyone seems to say, why don't you speak to Paul Rowe?
Wow. This detective was certainly worthy of some sort of special award for his efforts with Sue Neill Fraser's case. Not only were people at the yacht club saying, check out this guy, but I will point out too, there's actually a register in Tasmania of moorings. So you can actually contact the relevant marine authority and get a copy of the register of the moorings. It's a really long list, but I was able this year to get a copy of the Register of Moorings from 2009-2010. So I'm pretty certain that detectives in 2009 could have actually gotten a copy of Moorings themselves. At the very least, it would have allowed them to identify the distance between the mooring where the Four Winds was and the closest mooring, whether or not a boat was registered there or not. Because I will point out too that this Paul Rowe was known for basically plonking himself on moorings wherever he wanted to be without actually paying for the moorings and then being made to move on. But I will also point out that Tas Police actually had photographs showing the Four Winds and Paul Rowe's yacht moored in very, very close proximity. So this guy is basically admitting to the fact that either he is grossly incompetent, and in doing the investigation he didn't look at photos or evidence that had been pulled together from the case, or he's outright lying, and he did know that Paul Rowe was moored very close to the Four Winds. I will point out though, Colin McLaren did mention that when he spoke to a lot of yacht owners, they did mention that they were never interviewed by Tas Police. So, crucial bit of information in the case. A violent criminal who was moored alongside, pretty much, the Four Winds. And what did Tas Police do with it? Nothing. Pay attention to how much redder this guy is becoming, and also to the fact that he is really starting to down those glasses of water.
I find that fascinating because very early in the piece, two of my detectives came to the Royal Yacht Club, and Paul Rowe certainly wasn't mentioned then.
Stephen Gleeson went into police headquarters sometime within a fortnight of the disappearance of Bob to talk to police about Paul Rowe as a suspect, and he had a meeting with a policewoman. Were you aware of that?
Look, no, I'm not aware of that offhand, and I don't know where you got that information from.
He'd been into the police headquarters to talk.
Oh, look, that's possible. I just don't remember that.
This is another strategy frequently used by this guy. When he's backed into a corner and he knows that giving an answer is going to make him look bad or prove that he did the wrong thing or has lied, he comes out with, "I don't remember that."
Because he seems to have said that he had a conversation with Paul Rowe, and Paul Rowe indicated to him that he had killed Bob Chaplin.
I certainly don't remember that. No.
That really is a worry when you look at a potential suspect.
After Susan was convicted, we went back and spoke to him again, and he was interviewed.
It was 2 years later.
Yeah, I think it was by the time he was spoken to. Yeah. Mm. But all I can tell you is my own personal view. Having spoken to Gleeson and Rowe, I think they're both drunks. Yes.
But why is drunkenness one of the things you raise in relation to dismissing these individuals as suspects? Drunkenness and violence go hand in hand. They're like peaches and cream.
Yeah, and maybe I overplay that. What I'm saying is, having spoken to both of them, interviewed both of them, I'm happy that they're not involved.
I'm going to challenge you. That I have to for the first time today, Peter. I must challenge you on that. The first time you spoke to these individuals was 2 years or more after the event. A woman's already incarcerated. As Stephen Gleeson tries to tell you that his mate Paul Rowe is a very dangerous guy, you dismiss him.
I wouldn't rely too much on anything Gleeson told me. They're basically 50-odd-year-old alcoholics, both of them. No doubt about that. I've interviewed both of them.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's great detective work. Yeah, let's disregard these two violent alcoholics because, well, they're alcoholics. So that's a good enough reason to disregard them. You've just got to question what the heck was going on in this guy's head. Why was he so determined to get a conviction against Sue Neill Fraser that he wasn't even interested in looking at characters like this? I'll point out also the fact that these guys were interviewed 2 years later has to do with Tas Police, but with Sue's counsel actually pushing for there to be a record of interview with these two men. I should also point out that after Tas Police finally interviewed Gleeson, he sold his boat and left Tasmania.
I noticed as we were talking, his jovialness started to wane. He looked worried and on edge, and in the end he'd consumed every bit of 2 jugs of water and was drinking fresh air. Do you think you cast the net wide enough?
I'm the first to say, having been a detective for a long time, that I think in hindsight we can always look at something else.
Nice talking to you.
Yeah. I don't think it's going to go away, is it?
No, there's no way, no. They'll be making movies about it one day. I was convinced at the end of the interview with Peter Powell that they never bothered to cover the ground that I would cover as an investigator. I had a clear impression that their investigation was not broad at all. They were locked on to Sue Neill Fraser within 2 days. I've had a lot of experience in a lot of nationally significant task forces, and I think they've all been to do with murders, and I've learnt one thing out of all of those task force assignments, that the truth is like the sun. You can shut it out for a while, but it ain't going away.
I agree completely with Colin McLaren's assessment. I think they did have tunnel vision right from the start. To me, this Inspector Powell comes across as someone who is incredibly arrogant. He comes across to me as being a little bit misogynistic. And it seems to me that for some reason he decided from the get-go that he didn't like Sue Neill Fraser and that he would rather pursue a case against her and ignore all the other criminals that were there on the periphery, which were far more likely suspects. You can see why I put off doing this video. Honestly, this is just one of many interviews that this Powell guy did, and he just makes my blood boil. There's just something about him. The way he spends the whole time with his head up in the air, like he's looking down on everyone. And just the way that he seems to try and think, well, he thinks that he's justifying his answers. And when he gets caught in a corner, he suddenly can't remember. I really look forward to the day when Sue's case is overturned and people like this Sergeant Plod have to actually eat their words and admit that they were wrong.